Hey guys, I'm sorry I could not be with you today. I had some family emergency come up and was not expecting to be gone, but I needed to make sure I got the rest of the lecture to you before you guys take your exam on Monday. And trust me, I know this is not ideal. It is currently 8 o'clock on Thursday night, so I'm not exactly happy about still being at school either. So I hope this will satisfy everyone. Hopefully they'll get a good sense at the end of Reconstruction. That's all we have left, just a few minutes. And as always, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to email me, and I will try to get right back to you as quickly as possible. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off last time with the impeachment, or the failed impeachment, of President Andrew Johnson. We saw that the House did vote to impeach him. However, the Senate did not. By one vote, they did not get that. However, all of those proceedings were taking place in the early parts of 1868, which was an election year. And in November, General Ulysses S. Grant was elected, and he would become the next president anyway. So let's go ahead and move on to our next section, and that is called the Retreat from Reconstruction. Go ahead and hide my mug so I'm not distracting anyone here. So the retreat from Reconstruction. What was happening towards the latter half of it? Well, by 1874, we've kind of skipped a few years. There have been about 6 years skipped here. By 1874, the Democrats are starting to resurge a little bit in both the federal and state level governments. And this happened for a number of reasons. Number one, the Republicans had gotten mired down in multiple scandals, even involving the White House. One of the most scandalous things to ever hit the White House in Grant's administration was what was called credit mobilier. And you might remember that from American history, but the big railroad scandal involving a lot of Republican officials. So there were a lot of scandals that hurt the Republican Party. But you also had the Republican Party splitting because, frankly, as it says on the lecture notes there, Northerners were growing tired of Southern politics. The Northerners were starting to split over multiple issues. You had, as I said before, the carpetbaggers. That was a term we discussed last time, who had gone down into the South and were taking advantage of the poor situation down there. By this point, they've actually gained so much power that they're even holding political offices. And you had many of these who were often Republicans who stayed there gaining power. They were seen as traitors in the North. And in fact, they took on the term scallywags, which is an awesome, somewhat piratey term. But scallywags, which was a white Southern conservative Republican, and they were seen as traitors by both the Northern Republicans as well as the Southern, primarily Democrats. But again, the carpetbaggers, you had Army officers that stayed down in the South. You even had many of the teachers. We talked about the thousands of teachers brought down to educate blacks. So the population was changing, and it affected the Republican Party. By 1875, only 4 states are controlled by the Republicans: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, and Louisiana. And you also had some problems. The tiring of Southern politics. You had some problems with the 15th Amendment. Now, we had introduced that yesterday, which was the right to vote regardless of race. And what's happened in the South is that many of those states are not granting the 15th Amendment because they are passing individual state laws which seek to bar participation, which often targets race. For instance, they would have literacy tests where you had to read a test word for word, and if you got any word wrong, you failed the literacy test and you could not vote. Well, of course, this is targeted directly at uneducated blacks, so it kept a lot of them from voting. Also, you had poll taxes. Once again, you had to pay a tax to vote. And again, that targets the poor black population in the South. So a lot of individual Southern states were starting to pass these individual laws that they knew would stop blacks from voting. And it became just kind of a tireless effort for Republicans to keep up denying that. Now, Congress tried. There had actually been 2 laws great laws that were put in place to try and keep the 14th and 15th Amendment in place. The first of those had actually been a law to prosecute individuals who were found to have violated black civil and voting rights. That gets struck down by the Supreme Court. So I'm moving on to letter B here, Supreme Court cases. So laws were struck down that tried to protect voting rights. The second law that was struck down by the Supreme Court happened in 1875, and there had been a law enacted by Congress which banned racial discriminations in the public, in an attempt to try and bar segregation from occurring. But this got struck down, and in both cases, the Supreme Court was making the argument that the 14th and 15th Amendment only applied to actions taken by states, not by individuals or even at the city level. So you had all these minor laws being passed, and the Supreme Court thought that those were well within states' rights to do that. So, the end of Reconstruction is happening. It's a slow disintegration at this point. By 1876, we have kind of the nail in the coffin for Reconstruction. Everybody's really getting tired of it by this point, and the nail in the coffin is the election of President Rutherford B. Hayes. Excellent beard. I always comment on the beards. But in 1876, we have one of the closest elections we have in our country's history. And just like what we had seen earlier when Andrew Jackson was running for president, no one garners a full majority of the Electoral College in 1876, and therefore the election is decided by the House of Representatives. Well, just like we saw in that corrupt bargain, we have another bargain being struck, and it becomes known as the Compromise of 1877. The compromise was this. The Republicans would get Rutherford B. Hayes into office, but they had to promise to remove all federal troops from the South. Now remember, the South has been occupied ever since the end of the Civil War by the Union Army, I guess at this point. We had divided up the South into 5 military zones, and what this deal does was Southern politicians would allow Hayes to become president, but the military occupation would come to an end, and everyone agreed to that. So, this was a pretty big slap in the face to especially black politicians, which I have not mentioned yet, but by this time there are some black politicians that are operating in Congress. This is a pretty big betrayal because what this opens the door for is full power to be assumed by the Democrats in the South. And in fact, that's what we end up seeing for the next few decades, and not few, for basically half a century. We will see the Democrats hold on to the South just like they had before the Civil War. And we are going to see the South become a cohesive political unit, which from now on will be called the Solid South. And they always tend to vote together. And so this is kind of where that starts. But this does effectively end Reconstruction. With the Democrats and Republicans, their power being split again between the North and the South. We don't see the radical Republicans anymore. Reconstruction comes to an end. So we had talked about some of the goals of Reconstruction before. Let's look at what goals were achieved, and then on the next slide, we'll look at the many goals that were not achieved. So it did achieve two things. Number one, the initial goal of restoring the Union, it did do that. The southern states are back into the fold. They are reincorporated, and they are now an active part of the Union. The second is this transition from slave labor to free labor. It does introduce a wage labor system into the South. However, I should put an asterisk on that because as we talked about, yes, these freedmen are making wages now. However, with the system of sharecropping that is now popping up throughout the South, what that means is that these workers are basically tied to the land. They are not allowed to often work elsewhere. Sometimes they're having to sign contracts which tie them to the land, in some cases to their former slave owners. And of course, these contracts took advantage of the workers, paying them very little wages, often charging them rent or loans for seeds to plant. And of course, the wages that they made never met up with those debts. So there's a lot of injustice going on still, although the economic transition, of course, can be said to have been completed. All right, well, let's take a final look here, our last slide on Reconstruction and our overall unit on the Civil War. This is often called the failed revolution, and I want to break that term down into two areas. Was Reconstruction a revolution? I would say yes, it was a revolution in two ways. Number one, when we look at the legislative branch, we see the Southern states actively participating in a federal system, and they are adhering to that. This is why, for many people, the Civil War was fought, because Southern states believed they could just nullify any law and get away with it. We don't see that argument anymore. There really isn't this argument for nullification after this. They do try to gain more power in the legislative branch, and successfully, I might add. The second, what I would call revolution, is for the 4 million people that have just been released from slavery, who, even though it is still not anywhere near what we would consider a good life, we have raised millions of people out of bondage into a level where they have an opportunity for some kind of social mobility, economic mobility, political representation. That's pretty revolutionary, even though it's by far nowhere close to being perfect. But Reconstruction will always be remembered as a failure, and for many reasons. But that third goal we had talked about the other day of Reconstruction, the enforcement of equal and civil rights, utterly fails Black Americans. The 14th and 15th Amendments are not truly enforced until almost 100 years later. The inability of the federal government to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendment is an utter failure of the Reconstruction period. To give you some stats to back that up, only about 15 to 20% of office holders, those politicians in the South, were Black. So when you look at their populations, where in some states, 60, 70% Black, and only 15% representation, well, that's not a very good proportion. There are no Black governors, and there would not be for decades. So again, no representation there. Only in one state, and that was South Carolina, believe it or not, did Black office holders hold equal proportion to their population in that state. The removal of federal troops with the Compromise of 1877 meant that the Republican Party's power is completely collapsed at this point. They have become so divided that the leadership has completely failed. And overall, that's how you can define this. It is an overall lack of leadership, failure of leadership. And I would say liberal leadership, those that were pushing for, I don't know if moderate's the correct word, but pushing to move forward and try and get past these. We don't have people defending these amendments that were passed right after the Civil War, and the failure of leadership to follow up on that means that for many freedmen, they would continue to live their lives in some form of bondage for decades to come, very sadly. So that does it for our Civil War units. Again, if you look at the essay questions, you'll notice that many of them do have to deal with Reconstruction, so please make sure that you have followed up on that section, because there will most likely be at least one question selected, wink wink, nudge nudge. But overall commentary, it was a sad period, followed by this horrible war. So I wish it was a better ending, but frankly it's not. If you got any questions, feel free to email me. I'll get right back to you.